going to press. Right.
Great.
Over to you, Bob.
Thank you very much. So I'm Bob Liddon of management consulting in finance and banking. So I go a long way back with the EU and the euro. I mean, I was in charge of some of the implementation projects at the time. So a long way back, but now we're in, aren't we, full reset, rejoin mode. Who would have thought 2 weeks ago this would be the hot topic suddenly? Full-blown reverse Brexit. And I think we need to be honest. This is about using the Labour 166-seat majority in the House of Commons to get Brexit reversed before the people have a chance to have another say. So reset equals rejoin. It's rejoining the single market, industry sector by industry sector, as if that was different from rejoining the whole thing. And the EU Partnership Bill allows that to occur without any legislation going in front of Parliament. So our elected representatives don't get a say either, neither do we. Now, there's quite a few risks about that, and I think in the kind of enthusiasm to push this forward as quickly as possible, there's a question of what's the legitimacy of this when the Labour government only got 33% of the vote in 24, and that's gone down in the recent council elections. All right, they're not national, to 17. And in 2024, they undertook not to go into the single market, the reverse Brexit. I mean, is there any legitimacy to doing these things? Because the economic case, the supposed case for getting back into the EU, is nothing like as strong as the claims are made behind, firstly, cost us 4% of GDP, and the other one, 8%. So the 4% was actually a projection, a calculation by the Office of Budget Responsibility, that the UK might lose 1/4% per annum of productivity growth. So, it would have gone like that, and actually it's going to go like that if we left the EU. But there was no hard and fast evidence that it would cost us 1/4% productivity growth. And actually, unfortunately, in some sectors of the economy, particularly the public, productivity's gone down, not up, not even, less highly up. You can play around all day with these statistics. And then the OBR said, well, possibly if we lost 1/4% productivity growth, we might lose 1/4% economic growth, GDP growth. But really, who can say? Because the idea that this was a hard and fast, we will lose 4% of GDP over 15 years, is just not the case. And this latest 8% figure that has been latched onto is a methodology that compares performance of, is it 33 developed economies, and then shows we're lagging behind. But they included the US. And really, the study I've made, the study of the study, is that it's the US that we've really started falling behind, not the EU. And actually, our performance vis-a-vis the EU is more or less the same, begging the question whether we really achieved anything so far. We're not still stuck in the same rut. And it is a rut because our economy, the structure of our economy remains the same. High regulation, high tax, high state intervention, a public sector of somewhere 44% of the economy. But that's not the end of it, because on top of the public sector, you have this growing sector which I've called the state-directed sector, which is very much connected with Labour's industrial infrastructure and clean energy strategies, whereby you have nominally private companies, but what they're doing is a business that's entirely wrapped up with state priorities, public policy objectives. And in the end, what do you end up with? You end up with a public sector plus this other sector, effectively 65% of the economy under state control. And you're pushing towards the same statistics of the Soviet Union. And you wonder, why isn't there any wealth creation? And the EU certainly was ahead with its state-directed sector, but we're rapidly catching up and even overtaking. And then there's no free market left. And the result of that is high costs, high cost, high tax, high regulation. And within that, you can't have strong economic growth. It's an illusion. The idea that going into such an economic model can deliver high growth. It delivers high cost of living. It's delusionary to imagine that the solution to any of our economic problems is going back into the EU. It's really to go in a completely different direction, because it's that direction that voters really voted for. In 2016, they voted, no, we're not going to go remain in that model. And also the whole issues of having people making your laws who you can't sack. You cannot sack the European Commission. They formulate the priorities and the laws, not the Parliament. You can't sack the European Commission, not the way you can sack the government in Westminster. And participating in something like that reduces the power of your vote. And that's important, isn't it? The power of your vote. What else have we got with which to influence what happens? Diminish the power of your own vote. No, that's what the British people voted to leave. And we shouldn't be going back there. We should sort out our own problems. Thank you, Peter.
Unmuting myself. Thank you, Bob. Um, Very nicely on time as well. I
Good.
didn't even have to intervene there. Good. Thank you very much. I'm going to be assisted by PowerPoint because I'm a management consultant.
Ah.
Um, I imagine by the end we're not going to be poles apart on some of what we want in Britain. But anyway, I will take a different tack on not just economics. So just give me a moment to set the screen up. I think that's about right. Yes. Can you see a screen, Bob?
Yes.
You can, right. So this is the front page. The subject we agreed to talk about is a better Britain and a better Europe for a better world, regardless of whether we're in the EU or out the EU. I thought as a global sort of consultant, I thought that was a handy little title. So right, let's begin. Um, so I'm going to take a different tack insofar as I don't think it is all about economics. I used to work with a chap called Dr. Andrew Sentence, who was on the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee, and he told me not to move to Ireland because the GDP was worse. I said, when you buy a house, Andrew, do you just look at the GDP or do you look at whether the neighbours are nice? So anyway, but Andrew is a pure economist, so there we have it. So I produced a vision of a better Britain in a better Europe for a better world. If you're not on a phone, you can probably read it, and I'm not going to read it all out because we will just die by PowerPoint. But I'm going to pick one or two things on each slide, and the rest you can read, and we can discuss them as we will discuss with Bob as well. So I want to be able to drink clean water, eat fresh food, and embrace the diversity of British culture, from curries to chips, chops, kebabs, Chinese, and all the rest of it. I do want to welcome strangers here and help them contribute to our society. I do want to be friends with European neighbours and remove all the social, political, and other barriers created by Brexit. I don't believe that Keir Starmer is really on a rejoin project. I think we are in a death by 1,000 ameliorations, which so I think that is just as bad as doing the rejoin project. But I want to live without fear of losing my rights. We'll come back to that point because you did mention them, Bob. So the disadvantage of going second is, I've heard what you said. Um, I do want law. I want to rejoin the EU fully. I don't want death by 1,000 ameliorations. Still death, slow and painful. We can probably disagree on that bit. And I want the Britain to lead the way on measures to combat climate disaster and put vulnerable people first. I want a fair wage for a decent day's work. I want Britain to get back on the road to sustainable growth, not to tokenism in that area. I used to be a chemist. I believe that climate change is real, whether we caused it or it's the natural rhythm of the earth. We ought to be doing something about it. I want our politics to be inclusive and indeed democratic, following what Bob said. But I think there are other ways of doing that that include people such as citizens' assemblies. I want my vote to count more than it does in our broken British electoral system with first past the post. So that's I think there's reform, not reform UK, that there's reform needed in many areas actually. And I think I'd like Britain to develop food security. We've been systematically destroying our ability to feed ourselves since World War II. In a more disruptive world, I think we ought to be thinking about that. I want to live in a country that celebrates the arts and things like that. It was Winston Churchill that said, "What is art for? If only to punctuate the moments between wars." He didn't say that, but I think that's a rough translation. I do want us to have a better education system. I want a health service that is free to all at the point of use, not for certain people and not others. I do want our government to take action on large enterprises who do not pay their fair share of tax. We're not big enough to do that anymore. We're frightened of the big tech companies. And I'd like old and young people not to just live in sort of silos, but to be in a virtuous circle. I want a country that celebrates all faiths. It means we have more holidays, I suppose. And I want Britain to put investment back into the town's infrastructure and education and transport, something I think which contributed to that feeling that the country was left behind in 2016. And we are now sort of 10 years on. So it's time to have a look at that again, I think. Here are some of the opportunities I think we can have. They're not all economic. We won't regain all that we've lost, and we can argue all night about 4.5 to 8% and argue the merits of the different algorithms used to calculate that. But undoubtedly, the sum is huge. And businesses are still going out of business every week. Some just decided to relocate to Europe. So there is a financial implication of rejoining. Um, there should be stability for inward investment. Um, for quite a while, I think companies decided, shall I leave, shall I stay or shall I go, to quote the Clash, and they moved away because they thought Britain was a basket case. It would provide a fairly instant stability, and we'd be able to deal with asylum and immigration properly rather than trying to do token stupid stunts like stop the boats. And successive governments, of course, have failed to do that. And we now see that although immigration has come down, it's in high skilled sectors that it's come down. So this is why I think some people are still concerned with boats. Yes, we ought to restore the freedom of movement to young people and to fill skill shortages, which are many. We would not have taxi drivers, NHS workers, all sorts of things if we didn't have some immigrants here. We just wouldn't have lots of things that we take for granted. Deliveroo, for example. It costs us about 37 pence a day, roughly speaking, to have 70 plus years of relative peace in Europe. And that is the biggest reason, I think, why the EU was started and why we should consider rejoining. And I'd like actually to use, the EU is one of the bigger objects. It is a lumbering giant, I think, as Bob alluded to. But it is big enough to fight, the Elon Musks of the world. Um, and Zoom seems to think I've run out of time, so I haven't. I've upgraded, so I'll just carry on. Um, yes, Trump has arrived, and we have a very unstable world. So, if only for security, we need to do that. And of course, all the hassle that we have with visas, passport queues, and so on. And I'll finish just with where we started in 2016. Um, we cannot achieve any of that vision without rejoining the EU as a full member, as I believe, right across the steeple factors, not just the economics. It's a bigger decision than that for me. And just to return us to 2016, this is what we were promised on the tin. Take back control of our borders, money and laws. I don't know whether it's Farage or Boris that did it, but we have a weaker pound, immigration has increased significantly because you can't operate the Dublin Accord, and we haven't significantly diverged, which we probably do agree about from the laws we've made. We are, in a global society. We're in hock to the bigger players. So, as a small country, if we want to sell our stuff, we have to abide by other people's laws, and that's me done. And I'm going to have to do a little bit of fiddling now because Zoom is telling me that we've got 8 minutes left, and I upgraded this for unlimited time. So I'll stop now and we can take some questions, and I'll be fiddling in while we're doing this. I think I've got to sign in actually.
Yes. Well,
Anyway,
why don't we
Bob,
ask
over to
the
you.
others if they?
Yeah, that might be it. Oh no, I've upgraded. I didn't want to do that. Um, Bob, over to you, and I'll carry on trying to fiddle with this.
Would somebody like to ask a question of me while, because that rather if Peter's working on that.
Yeah, I put one in there. You touched on it in your points about sovereignty and the EU Parliament that we can't say. But yet we still in 2016 went ahead with a referendum. We weren't blocked in any way. We were able to successfully negotiate our way out of the EU. How could we do that if we didn't have some degree of sovereignty? Because surely the EU didn't want us to do that, really.
Well, so yes, we were. I mean, just I thought Mark Carney's intervention today to try to liken Alberta leaving Canada with Brexit was quite misplaced. We still were sovereign at the time of the Brexit referendum. Now, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but those of us who are old enough will remember the discussions, what led to that, and the discussions about the Lisbon Treaty. Now, the Lisbon Treaty created the EU as a sovereign nation, that we would have been a province of. At that point, we would have been like an Alberta within the EU. And we were first of all promised a referendum was it by Gordon Brown on the Lisbon Treaty, a referendum to approve it or not. That then was postponed to the 2010 general election. Cameron put it in his manifesto, but then dropped it in order to strike a coalition with the Lib Dems. And this all started building up, didn't it? Are we going to become, or this subset, this province in a way of a sovereign nation without a say-so? And at that point, we still were able to do that. But I'm not sure that these countries, particularly the ones in the euro, have any chance of having their electorate say, no, we can't go out. I mean, it continues to amaze me that people think that they can get out of the euro, that a country once in the euro has any real feasible pathway out of it. But were still able to exercise sovereignty in a way that a Belgium and an Austria no longer can. And maybe, just not being in the middle of Europe geographically allows us to take a wider view. Yeah, I'd say that we were still able to at that time, and I'm not sure. I'm absolutely certain we couldn't do that if we were a Euro country. There's no way out once you're in there.
Thank you. It's interesting to consider. I hadn't realized it until a little while ago. Just wanted to see if anyone else had thoughts on it.
Yeah, I see something in the chat from Phil. Well, they can pass their own laws, but wasn't it the percentage of British lawmaking while we were in the EU that something like 70% of all our laws were simply enactments of EU directives and regulations? I think it was something of that order. And there were only limited areas where we could formulate our own laws. And whenever there was a conflict, EU law took precedence. And in EU law, built into that is the because EU authorities are there acting in the public good, or they say they're acting in the public good, if you have a lawsuit between yourself and an EU institution, you go in with a disadvantage because the card can always be played by the opposition. They're acting in the public good, so that will be okayed by the European Court of Justice. And that happened particularly with some of their equivalent schemes to our Bank of England quantitative easing, the buying up of gilt-edged securities. German academics and politicians had a lawsuit whereby they their view was that the European Central Bank had exceeded its mandate and wasn't allowed to do this, that, and the other. And they lost every time because the European Court of Justice said, well, the European Central Bank is there to act for the higher public good. So whatever they do is fine. Effectively, they can pretty much do what they like, especially in an emergency. They were allowed to go beyond their technical mandate. Well, wait a minute. That's supposed to limit them. No, they were allowed to go further because it was they thought it was in the public good.
I'm back now, by the way. I hadn't paid the
I,
gas bill. I thought I had paid it, but it didn't send me a notification. But I went through the other day
yes.
and it just said it's anyway, it's done. I'm back.
Just to clarify, the
you put
ECB
your
did not go beyond its mandate when Draghi stood up and said we will do whatever it takes. The EU has a mandate for price stability, and how that gets interpreted is not just an inflation rate of 2% plus or minus something. It's actually a mechanism to ensure the pursuit of stability. And so the ECB was acting perfectly within its mandate.
Well, no, I don't agree because when it, for example, started buying securities into its programs, firstly, out of line with the percentage that a particular member state's economy stood in relation to the size of the economy, that was a major departure that wasn't in their mandate. That couldn't be.
There's no such element.
Sorry, let me finish. That couldn't be
let him finish.
aligned with the concept of their mandate. And when they started buying up, particularly new bond issues by member states, they were supposed to only act in financial markets once securities bonds had been issued with technical matters, price stability, money supply. But they started just buying wholesale entire bond issues issued by Spain, Portugal, whoever. And that was really quite beyond anything that had been allowed them in their mandate. And they just said, oh, it's fine. It's for price stability, the magic words, and then all objections go away.
So Nick,
that's not the case. I mean, the ECB, the crisis occurred because of the lack of clarity over what the ECB would or would not do, what it was permitted to do, not permitted to do.
Well, this was
the crisis. No, this is the financial crisis and the Greece and Portugal and so forth. The crisis only ended when the ECB clarified that and the markets believed it. The ideas that you're talking about in terms of buying this, buying that, keeping a ratio and so forth, those would not have worked in ending the crisis. Draghi stood up and said, we will do whatever it takes. He had the mandate to do that. He had the mandate to do that.
Well, he gave
and he eventually
he's supposed to live under the rule of law like we all are.
He eventually received the backing of Germany for doing that. Not
eventually, but not at the time.
Well, that was perfect. That was all lack of clarity, which was behind the crisis in the first place. We've got clarity now. It's why there won't be, you never say never, there won't be another Eurozone sovereign debt crisis because the issues were resolved. The ECB will do whatever it takes.
So I now have a question.
Go on, sorry, Peter.
No, go on, finish your point, Bob, first.
Oh no, I haven't got a point. Sorry, I thought
Oh, I've forgotten mine now.
there seem to be lots of questions in the chat, and maybe
Are
you could
there? So I've
pick them
been
up.
I've been off grid, so we'll pick them up. But I'll take one first, and it's to the question of democracy.
Yes.
As an organisation consultant, never mind my life playing guitars and talking to businesses about business. As an organisation development consultant, I've never met a perfect organisation in the world. And generally, as they get bigger, they become more entropic and slow and bureaucratic and what have you. And our parliament is almost medieval in some of its practices, and the EU has its faults, undoubtedly. However, one does get your 5 minutes to speak and then you're told to shut up, whereas you can filibuster this parliament into all kinds of things. And the question of the executive, of the unelected executive, I don't see that as being so difficult for two reasons. One, I still yet to find anyone that has told me that the EU is bearing down on us, making us drive on the wrong side of the road and drink in litres instead of pints, and all these things that Leave voters have in the past said we would have to do. So I don't really see how I'm being controlled on a daily basis. But the other part of this, at the high level of committees and the EU Parliament, is all right. So let's say it's not elected. It's then a meritocracy, a bit like Unilever. I'd almost rather have people being selected based on merit than just sort of our parliament seems to be a different problem. I spoke about that with our first past the post system, and you mentioned it with the mandate of Labour. Undoubtedly, that is unfair. But staying to the point, I'm not sure I fully agree about the EU bearing down on us with laws of losing control, except in the sense that it's no different than most systems around the world.
Yes, I suppose when you have a meritocracy, um, who selects whom?
Mm,
Who selects one another? I mean, this is, I think, a problem we have here is how much of our governance comes from unelected bodies where some kind of network, and the one I don't like, and I'm sure other people will have a completely different view of how this works. The type I don't like is when somebody gets a medal like an MBE or an OBE for doing something, that's fine, maybe, then that qualifies them to be on the trustee board or advisory board or non-executive this or that in the most unbelievably diverse fields. Like somebody I know who worked for a charity, got a CBE, that's fine. Now, nuclear waste management, University of East Anglia, financial ombudsman, never worked in nuclear energy, any of it. But now she's got 14 simultaneous appointments, all of them by appointment, by selection, supposed meritocracy. But what are the criteria?
so, well, where
I mean,
I feel we might be going with this is the world isn't perfect, and all organisations has faults. I could, I don't think I want to obsess about fixing everything in the EU, but I do think that we have many faults that are of equivalence impact in this country with the bizarre system we have in Parliament, which I've been into a few times. But anyway.
hmm. Well, I've just seen somebody ask about the House of Lords.
Well,
Well,
actually,
we've
there's
kicked
another.
out, they've kicked out the
I have another.
hereditary.
I have another impediment here. It sounds like I haven't organised this. I normally see the chat, but because of what I did on Zoom, you're going to have to. Whoever wants to put their hand up is going to have to put their hand up, and you can pick them off. I can't see the chat, so
Oh, can't
be
you?
my
Oh,
guest
right.
to intervene. Carry
Yes, somebody I was just asked about the House of Lords.
on.
But now the House of Lords is becoming increasingly selected by who? Who selects who goes into the House of Lords? Um, and I don't see that as any better, really. Uh, if you can flood the thing with your own people of your own political tartan, that's the whole thing ceases to have a relevant function, doesn't it? I would like to pick up on one thing, Peter, and
Hmm.
in your appear to not like large tech companies. Well, for me, one of the greatest difficulties that occurs when you look at somewhere like Luxembourg and the Republic of Ireland is how much they manage to suck towards themselves economic activity, GDP, growth, and profits, say from sales of Amazon. I mean, maybe everybody knows that when you buy anything on Amazon, even if it's only come from 10 miles down the road, you bought it from Amazon Luxembourg.
Hmm.
Have a look at the invoice. You bought it from Amazon Luxembourg. So that increases Amazon Luxembourg's GDP. It means there's no taxable profit in the UK, and any taxable profit is taxed, if at all, in Luxembourg. And this is something where, after Brexit, we really should have had a go at. And for the UK, the real difficult one is the Republic of Ireland,
Hmm.
with their, it's not just the low tax rate, but it's an anomaly that should have been attacked years ago, but there's nothing you can do about it. And that was like we were losing 15 billion quid of corporation tax back in 2017. It's probably 30 billion now, just because the structure of the EU allowed these amounts of money to be siphoned off and booked in other member states and leave us just sucking wind, basically.
Well, I don't think I'm going to disagree hugely. Well, I did pick off the tech companies, but they're not. I'm not demonizing. I use them as an example of large companies that don't
Yeah.
pay tax. I would also say it's an imperfect world, and there's a lot of work to do. And successive governments of all colours seem to not have done this. So there's another job that needs to be done, whether it's tech companies or people that really don't pay tax. What I would say is I'm really not politically aligned with any party, but I probably fit some idea of a centrist sort of person in a way. And I don't believe that the world is flat and people do seek advantage. We've just seen Trump doing that very thing in a very transactional way, at an extreme. And if Luxembourg can pull a stunt like that, then they will. So that's yeah,
Mm.
that moral hazard will happen if people feel that they've got the means to do it. That said, regulation in a global world, particularly with AI and computing, I think is very important. I wrote a book on AI in 2018, and I said that it would either be a harmonious fusion of man, woman, and machine, or we'd have war of the worlds. In fact, we probably have both of those things and a number of other things competing.
Mm.
And Trump, of course, did say that he doesn't want to, he'll just tariff people now. We've moved into this very transactional world. And when Sunak said he wanted to be an AI superpower, I really sighed a bit because I thought this means he's going to take all the restrictions off of the safeguards off of doing bad stuff. And I think that probably is what good government is for at one level, is to stop people doing bad stuff. So
Mm.
I wish perhaps the EU would almost do a little bit more of that. I mean, they've given us they do things that like the single USB socket, but
But haven't they just come up with something on AI? I mean, in the last few days,
I don't know.
I
Yeah.
haven't, I thought they'd come up with some fat draft of restrictions, which had AI people in the EU doing what we can still do, Peter,
Yeah.
tear our hair out.
Well, see,
We've still
this
got
takes us back to Britain for a moment because when we did Brexit, we were absolutely keen to do deals with anyone at any price. The CPTPP was a good example. Is it 0.08% growth in 10 years or 15, depending on when you look at it? It's worthless. The Australia deal well, it was mainly about sort of farming, really. The India deal, they wanted to send their students here, so we end up with more immigration. So we were in a fire sale situation after Brexit, partly because of Boris getting it over the line and getting Brexit done, as he said. So Trump has exploited that position, and I think Sunak was sensitive to it, but saying we are now open as Silicon Glen, we're going to do this, and I do think that's what regulation, good regulation, is for, to mitigate the worst ills of society. Otherwise, the question we could have addressed is why have politicians, which I'd have just said, no, don't do it.
Hmm.
That was a bit of a ramble, but that's my view on it anyway.
Yes.
What other questions have we got? Someone put their hand up, or
Peter, if you've got WhatsApp on your phone, I put the questions to your WhatsApp. You might see them a bit
oh,
better.
thank you very much. Thank you.
Where there's a will, there's a way.
hmm So that's why we need technology, because I can now do two things at once again. Continue, someone, please.
Yeah, I put in a question about the single market. Basically, I've understood, Bob, that you see any move to join the single market or partly join the single market without a further democratic mandate as a betrayal of democracy. Maybe I'm putting too many words in your mouth. We know that at the time of the referendum was a kind of blank check. There was it just said leave the EU. It didn't say in which manner. And some of the leading Brexiters, I remember, were saying things like, no one is threatening our place in the single market. We can be like Norway, we can be like Switzerland, etc. I want to ask you, Bob, basically, how do you feel about the fact that if you look around Europe, if the single market is a problem, every single country in Europe is either in the single market as in the EU, in the single market as part of the EEA, partly in the single market for goods, and that even includes Northern Ireland and Switzerland, or trying desperately to join the EU as up to 10 candidate members, leaving only UK, Belarus, and Russia, which is kind of not the best company in the world. How do you feel about that? Do you think you disagree then with the leading Brexiters? I can't remember which ones they were, who were saying no one's threatening a place in the single market. Do you think it's good that we're out of the single market?
Well, I'd never heard that before. To me, Brexit meant leave the single market, customs union, the works. That's what it
It didn't say
was.
that. It wasn't written on the ballot, and people were misled.
Well,
You
you
must have
say,
heard.
I mean, let's not
Yeah.
go down that. That's a
Yeah.
rabbit hole. People were misled. Well, people were misled by the 5 million quid brochure sent round by Osborne and Carney saying, vote Brexit and the roof will fall in. Well, both sides were equally culpable. No, I'd go simply to the Labour Party manifesto in 2024. They said that's a red line. We won't rejoin the single market. And now they're rejoining bit by bit, sector by sector. That's it.
So if the single market is such a bad idea, why
No,
is
I'm
it
not saying
only?
it's a bad idea or good
Okay.
idea. I'm saying that was in the Labour Party manifesto, and now they're rejoining sector by sector. That's a breach of the manifesto. And if we can't rely on a manifesto, what's the purpose of having a general election?
It's a very good question.
Yeah.
Do you
Yeah,
want to come
because
back?
that
I
eliminates the
do.
power of our vote. We put people in, and then they can act very, very quickly. So 5 years is a long enough time to do all sorts of stuff that if you have an elastic enough manifesto, and we've become very used to elastic manifestos with wordings in them that people can look what we can do and still make out this is covered by the manifesto. But the Labour Party manifesto was absolutely explicit. We're not rejoining the single market. That's a red line. Now look where we are.
I think we've got two issues here, Bob. I think one is the issue concerning Labour's promise. Now, I think there is, I wouldn't say emerging consensus, but I think a lot of people, including many in the Labour Party in government, privately thinking that the red lines were a mistake. They were not necessary. I'm talking only politically, not economically.
I said that. You
They're
can't say
necessary.
that. There's
Well,
no emerging consensus. That is
I'm
so wrong.
I
There's
can't say
no
that.
emerging
No, I can't. No, no.
consensus.
I'm saying about the red lines being a mistake. I'm talking about John Curtis. If you look at John Curtis' analysis of the 2024 general election result, the Labour won with 33% of the vote because the right wing vote was split between the Conservatives and Reform, and it was a weird result, a freak result that can never be
Yeah.
repeated. But there is this myth, in my opinion, this is my opinion, that they needed those red lines, and the red lines were a causal factor in their victory. I don't believe it was. Now, the other argument uh, is um, is joining the single market partly joining of merit? If it is, what's the democratic way of doing that? Because you seem, I'm not quite clear where you stand, because you obviously probably don't want the UK to be like Belarus and Russia, completely out of everything. You're not actually saying that the single market or parts of it are bad, because if it was that's the case, Switzerland wouldn't be half in it, Norway, etc. Even Northern Ireland now, as part of the agreement in terms of Northern Ireland, is a de facto member of the single market for goods. So where do we
I
go?
know, and that's a
Where do we go from
disgrace,
there?
isn't it? That's a total flagrant departure from the terms of the Brexit referendum to leave the Northern Ireland in the single market.
It
That's
didn't
a
say single
democratic
market on the ballot
affront to the
paper. It never
vote that
said single market
occurred.
or customs union. It was a
I
blank
don't,
check.
you know,
A blank check. You
no, no,
could have
sorry.
left. Could have left
We
and
can't
be like
discuss
Switzerland.
Northern Ireland without talking about the Belfast Agreement, the
One at
Tony
a time,
Blair.
please.
Sorry, we
Bob.
can't talk about.
Yeah, go on.
Sorry, who's got the
You've
flag?
got the mic, Bob, then Paul.
Yes. So the Good Friday Agreement was used by the EU with Obama and the Dublin government to muscle this frustration of Brexit. We were muscled into it, and it's left quite wrongly a part of the United Kingdom, not actually in the United Kingdom, because imports and exports between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, or Britain, the big bit that we're sitting in here in England, are treated as if they're exports to a foreign country, and that's a flagrant um, denial of the meaning of the Brexit vote.
I'm,
So,
I'm going to intervene briefly, Paul. I'll send it back to you after that. We've got a number of brilliant, now I've seen the comments, we've got a number of brilliant comments. We've got two or three people with their hands up. So back to you, and then I want to just come back at Bob on, well, I'll come back now. When Paul said that, that the Labour red lines are a problem, and you said there's no sense of that. Both Paul and I've worked inside Parliament and been to talk to MPs in Labour for Europe. There is substance to what Paul is saying, but go on, Paul.
Yeah,
yeah,
all right, they
just a
said
question,
that.
Bob. I just got a follow-up question, Bob. Then I'll pass the floor to somebody else. Okay, you say about Northern Ireland that you think this was a betrayal of the vote, that this agreement should not have happened, and you seem to have a position which seems to be mostly very much in line with the Unionists, the Democratic Unionists, in terms of what you're saying about this. I don't know.
Maybe.
That's what I feel. Although I know in Ireland, the latest opinion poll, 72% would like to rejoin the EU. But anyway, that's beside the point. What would be your solution then? Given there was no easy solution, we can all agree Northern Ireland was a difficult one to deal with. There was no simple solution. If you don't like what was agreed, what would be your solution?
Yeah, I'd rip up the Windsor framework, the Northern Ireland Protocol, and say it's part of the UK. That's it. Thank you.
And just on the way to the next question, I did meet with Michel Barnier some years back, and he said there were three things uppermost in their mind when they did the negotiation. First, and quite correctly, was to protect the enterprise. If you ran a golf club and someone wanted to leave, you'd worry about the other 27 members, wouldn't you, really? So that was the first thing. The second thing was really about making sure that Ireland and Northern Ireland were treated fairly. So they did probably prioritise that quite highly. We have some brilliant questions in the chat, but we have Bruce and Paul Byrne. So I'll take Bruce first. Yeah,
Yes, I just want to make the point that this is a constitutional matter, rejoining, not an economic one, which is, I think, uh, why Labour was so wary of putting anything like that in the manifesto. And what is happening now, I think, is purely to do with a leadership contest. This is a constitutional matter which was dealt with, which it had to be, with a referendum on the way out. And so you can't just, slide your way back in, or, it just can't be done like that. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The other th my question was actually for you, Peter, because I read your list of wishes,
Mm,
and I think one of the things, when we criticism of Brexiteers is that they have nostalgia for the good old days. But I think exceptionalism is to do with one very important thing, which is common law. And the nation state is, the jurisdiction of that law is what is the foundation of democracy. And I don't see anything on that list that couldn't be dealt with by a sovereign UK Parliament. There's very, very little I can see on that list that requires us rejoining the EU. I mean, to me, it's just, um, I don't know, it's a mindset rather than a reality.
okay, I'll take your first point first, and perhaps I don't know if Bob would like to come back on that as well. But um, we don't need a referendum to rejoin the EU. I have that on good authority from a Labour MP. I went to visit him in his constituency. Labour, of course, have, whether you like it or not, a majority, just about hanging on due to their latest infighting with themselves. And you're probably right. This is all about, problems inside the Labour Party, but they don't actually need a referendum. They might choose to have one, like a christening, to make it all right. We could maybe have some red button diplomacy on a Saturday night to make it okay. But of course, whilst nearly two-thirds of people think Brexit was a mistake, people don't want to rerun the difficult conversations. In management consulting terms, Brexit is a wicked problem. You're multifaceted, don't know really what the problem is, don't know what the answer is, and people really got very twisted up with what they meant, what they thought it meant, which there were 16 words on the ballot paper, and then people thought, what did it mean? Which is how we ended up with Theresa May's deal, which was probably the high point of Brexit deals, and then Boris Johnson trashed it in order to get it done. To your second point, really, um, just remind me what the question was of the second point, and then I shall shut up.
Yes, whoops, yeah, I am open. Yeah, I can't see anything on that list of yours, your
Oh
wish
yeah,
list,
yeah,
that
got it.
requires us to be part of the EU. So I'm just wondering whether it's just a mindset that people have that, the our common law is what makes us exceptional from continental Europe.
Yeah.
It's the way we do things. It's why our economy runs like it does. When we adopt so much legislation from a top-down organization like the EU, it must cause slow growth.
Mm,
Even though, the regulation is mostly geared towards our trade with the EU,
yeah,
it impacts our entire economy.
I've got you.
And it's the jurisdiction of common law is the basis of our democracy. And all the things you've listed as a wish, I wish we could do this. We can do that with our
Well,
sovereign parliament.
I did cast the net wider than Brexit, and said these are the things I'd hope Britain means, because certainly the Reform Party thinks it seems to be about flags and things like that. So I went for a wider sweep, some of which don't require the undoing of Brexit. Uh, I could do a glib answer by saying you need to read the books that we wrote for the connections, because
I'd love to.
I'll send,
And
I'll
you could do
try.
likewise.
Yeah, I'll try and send them to you. But I mean, in 5 minutes of PowerPoint, there's not much you can do to then draw the threads of that together, other than much of the social aspects of immigration are confounded by Brexit. The economics, I think, are, for me, clear, even if Bob and I don't agree on that. And some of the constitutional, the voting things, they don't require Brexit. But in fact, undoing Brexit would itself be an act of changing our democracy, really, if we did it without a referendum. But I think the views differ on that. I have it from a horse's mouth, or several horses' mouth, who I talk to MPs all the time. They don't need to have it, but I think for closure, there might be a case for some vote. But nobody has the appetite for that because families have broken up. My sister and I no longer speak. She lives in Tunbridge, and she voted for Brexit because she believed that Tunbridge High Street would be colonised by Muslims. She's old, very old, but that's what she read in the Daily Mail, you see, or what she thought she read in it. Right, let's have some other questions. Thank you. Another question. So, Paul, please. Then Steve.
Hi guys. I'm very cognizant of the fact here, Peter, of not wanting to get on a soapbox. So I will try my best, but please feel free to beat me off if I do go on such a. Firstly, I had a small little giggle when I think Bob, you said, Bob, congratulations. I don't disagree with a lot of what you said. It doesn't mean I agree with it, but I don't disagree with much of it. Where you said Labour's manifesto, 2024 manifesto, we're not rejoining Britain or the EU. If we believed everything we saw in manifestos over the years, we're all big enough and ugly enough to know, unfortunately, our politicians do lie to us. The Northern Irish Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, I know long past, the Windsor Agreement had to be put in place because otherwise those people up there would maybe shooting at each other again, something none of us want to happen. But my question, Bob, would be, and it's always been my bugbear, getting out of Europe, and there's a lot wrong with Europe. Do not misunderstand me at all. But having whinging and moaning and whining about it, is it not better to be at the table to try and fix it? Because we definitely cannot fix it from the outside.
Well, that's a very wide-ranging question. I'll just talk about Ukraine. I know that might seem it's coming out of left field. In 2014, we were at the table. We were part of an EU response to the occupation of Crimea, Luhansk, and what was the other one, the other province? That EU response, now the EU put itself center stage. It said, we're going to sort this out, don't worry. We were part of that. And what was it? What came about after that? A complete sellout. And the sellout was curated by Angela Merkel because German economy was completely dependent on cheap Russian oil supplies. So our obligations to Ukraine, which were principally contained in the Budapest Memorandum, under which they gave up their third largest stock of nuclear weapons. Russia, the US, and the UK jointly guaranteed the territorial integrity of the Ukraine, and the EU wasn't a player at the table. So when this happened with this taking over of Crimea and the other provinces, the EU, under the auspices of Angela Merkel, pushed themselves right in the front, said, okay, the Budapest Memorandum doesn't really apply. We're going to sort this out. And Merkel made absolutely sure that there was no international response whatsoever of any meaning. Sold them down the river. Munich 1938 all over again. 2022, we're not in the EU anymore. We led the international response to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We could not have done that if we'd still been part of the EU and subjected to German political control of the EU. Do you think Ursula von der Leyen would have agreed to what we did. And finally, years later, months later, the EU come tacking up. But we were able to lead the response, but precisely because we weren't in the EU. I think Alan, sorry, I've lost. Have I gone mute? I think you've gone mute, Peter.
Yes.
Unusually.
It was Steve, but Alan, go on first because we have time, and then Steve.
I can't hear Alan.
Alan, we can't hear you. That's
Oh,
it.
I think I'm unmuted now.
Yes.
Bob, just a small thing. You seem to have forgotten that it was Daniel Hannan who said, no one is talking about leaving the single market. And it was Owen Paterson who said, and I quote, in both cases verbatim, only a madman would leave the single market. And my question to you was, I've said, hello, Bob, are you seeking to avoid or perhaps ignore the headline adverse economic impacts of Brexit as identified by Nick Bloom and his co-authors at Stanford? And the first was UK GDP 6 to 8% lower. I think this is crucial. Business investment 12 to 18% lower. Employment 3 to 4% lower, productivity 3% lower. Why would any firm wish to invest in the UK? Like, I mean, why are we losing Japanese car manufacturers when there is a customs barrier between us and the single market? And the single market is, what is it, 10 times the size of the UK market? And you seem to have glossed over that. Now, I know the
I'm sorry, I'm
conversation.
not
Peter's
glossing over it at all, because I just don't
right,
think half of that is
Peter's.
true. I don't think it's true. I mean, I was reading something from the European Stability Mechanism this afternoon. Why is productivity in the EU so bad? Why aren't we getting business investment in?
I'm talking
Why
about
this? Why that?
what the UK lost. As I have listened
Well, I
to
don't think
Nick
it's
Bloom,
true. I mean, you could listen to people
but you can
talking.
see it. You can see it in the
No, you
Japanese
can't
car
see it.
firms pulling out
Can't
of their
see it.
investment in the UK.
Okay, electronic vehicles, EU driving the way towards electronic vehicles. That's why they're shutting down. It's nothing to do with Brexit,
And the
except it's
impact
become
on
part
small
of it
business. I
because
mean, I've seen the impact
we
on
are
small
just
business of
copying.
the. I mean, why can't we have at least an agreement that it would be jolly good to get back in the single market
No,
because of the
I don't
economic
agree with
benefits?
that
It was
because
just
I
kind of
don't
like,
agree with it. And
well,
the people voted not to. The people voted to leave the thing. And Labour renewed that pledge,
no,
promise
Hannon,
in its
who was a key
manifesto.
thought leader, he said no one's talking about it. Peter's saying I need to stop.
No, I'm saying that
Well, it's
you started
democracy.
your point by mentioning Daniel Hannan and the other guy. They undoubtedly did do that. And if I should
Well,
intervene,
I don't say they didn't, but
if
lots
I,
of people have said
well,
lots
if
of
I should
things.
intervene, when it said, should we stay or should we go? Nobody knew what go meant. And then the debate started. And of course, Theresa May thought, well, go means we can have certain things, but not other things. And there are 50 shades of Brexit that we went through at the beginning, which is we don't need to go backwards, as you said. But nobody actually, there was disarray because nobody thought they would win, is the first problem that happened. And as we know, the people that voted the following day Googled what was Brexit. Nobody had a clue. And that caused that parliamentary paralysis, whilst people churned what was the acceptable Brexit that could be put to the British people. And of course, there was no acceptable Brexit because we're still here talking about it. Sorry, go on, and then we'll.
Well, I think Steve has been waiting for quite a long time to
Well, no,
ask his.
I'd like you to finish off answering Alan. So
Oh, sorry.
he did start
Yeah,
by.
well, I don't believe the National Economic
Are you
Bureau.
familiar
I don't
with? Are
look.
you
If you
familiar?
like, sorry,
Are you
Alan, will you
familiar
let
with
me
Nick's
answer then?
analysis?
Well, didn't hear that because I thought I was speaking, but there we are.
The question was, did you hear did you hear Alan's point about the analysis?
Well, there's analysis. The National Economic Bureau, Research Bureau, flawed analysis. Office of Budget Responsibility, flawed. The Project Fear, Mark Carney, all flawed. Hasn't happened.
are you familiar with Nick Bloom's analysis? Quick answer, yes or no?
No, I'm not, because he's
Well,
just
then, can I
one
suggest
of
you look at
50,
it? I'll send
one
you
of
the link if you
50,
like.
one of 50 analysis that all say the same thing, that the roof will fall in, and it hasn't.
Well, the roof did partially collapse. We never really recovered the position on the money. The laws, as I mentioned at the beginning, we substantially have most of the laws that we had before because of the fact we're a global country, and if you want to make 3-pin plugs and export them to Europe, then you have to make them a certain way, and so on and so forth. But anyway, we need to get more questions. So, Paul, you've got your hand up again, but Steve's been waiting for ages. Steve.
Hi, yes. So I just wanted to take the opportunity because I've been chatting to people in the chat, and I've heard a few things this evening that I agree with, and a few things that I know are not true. And I think there are, as we've said, and I think both of you have mentioned, there were statements throughout the Brexit campaign that were true, and there were statements that were false, and there were statements made on both sides that were incorrect. Unfortunately, some of those mistruths have continued on to this day, and I've heard a few of them in the last few moments. So I just wanted to take a chance to respond to one of them. And Peter, you mentioned that there were 50 different shades of Brexit. And those we could have done a hard leave and we could have done a soft leave. And Alan, you mentioned Dan Hannan said we wanted to stay in the single market. No one's threatening our place in the single market. Owen Patterson had mentioned something as well about staying within the single market. So the great myth throughout the Brexit debate was that there were more than one kind of leaving the EU. There was never more than one kind of leaving the EU. There was just Article 50 and the Article 50 process, and you leave. So the idea of we could have stayed in the single market, could have stayed in the customs union, has always been a fiction, I'm afraid, because you had to leave first, and then if we wanted to stay in the single market, we would have left the single market first and then applied to rejoin, as the only people who can negotiate trade agreements, which the single market is, if you are an EU member, is the EU. So we were not, as a legal member of the EU, we were not legally entitled to negotiate membership of the single market until we were no longer an EU member. So that's why that transition period existed, so that we could negotiate the free trade agreement afterwards, as otherwise we wouldn't have been legally allowed to negotiate it at all. So that's the first thing. So whether or not people said different things about you can be in the single market, you can stay in the customs union, all of that is a nonsense, because there was only ever one way to leave. There were multiple ways of having a new relationship after we left. That is absolutely true. But the actual process of leaving, there was only ever one way to leave. And from my position, I think that's what Theresa May actually meant. Brexit means Brexit because there is only one way to leave, and that was what people were arguing about, was their ways of constructing a different future to what is actually leaving.
So
sorry, that's my soapbox moment. So my actual question, so so I don't want to take up too much time. I just wanted to address that for a moment. There's been a lot of mention of different polling this evening, of polls that are there's a majority who say they want to be closer to the EU. There's a majority who think the vote may have been a mistake. There's a majority for people who like the idea of rejoining. I don't disagree with any of those. All of those polls do exist. However, every single poll that has been done in the past 5 years, highlighting any of the implications of rejoining, all have a massive swing back to staying out. As soon as you mention any of the necessities of actually becoming an EU member again. So all of the things that we had before. So my question is to you, Peter, are you aware of those polls? Have you seen those polls? Because you've mentioned all of the other ones, but you haven't mentioned the ones that say, actually, you'd have to join the euro, you'd have to join Schengen, you'd have to join the EU Migration Pact. They all show a massive swing back to, no, stay the hell out of the EU, we don't want any part of that. But you haven't mentioned any of that polling, and neither has anyone else in the room. So no. I'm curious as to whether or not that polling is being advertised correctly, if it's being distributed correctly by our media, or if it is being intentionally ignored.
I haven't mentioned polls during my talk at all. Um, and I have a huge, don't think I meant Omnisis. I didn't mention any of those things. No, I haven't. Daily Mail, who have regular polls now. What I will pick up with you is this idea that we, the public, will set the terms of what the rejoining deal would be. And the book we wrote together, 60 of us, I said our mandate is to get the political paralysis broken to the point that someone wants to fill in the paperwork, say we'd like to rejoin. It is not up to me or anyone else for that matter to say, but we must have the euro, we must have this, we can't have that, we can't have the other. That is the problem was the Brexit debate was on in public every day. The papers were saying that something had happened. In reality, like Donald Trump, there's a few people around the table that decide that for us. We do not decide that. Our job is quite clear to persuade the politicians to have the moral courage to do the thing. Because if, for example, we wanted out of the euro, this is controversial. Some of my friends here don't agree with this, so you can shout at me later. If we want to keep the pound, I think, like Michel Barnier would say, everything is on the table until nothing's on the table. We could have the pound if we wanted to. It might come at a terrible cost, socially, culturally, politically, and economically. But I suspect if we said this is what we want, um, there'd be a fool to say you can't have it, but it would be with consequences. The EU is a massive legal and negotiating system, so I don't think it's up to us to decide what's in. And you're absolutely right, though. As soon as you start saying you'd have to have Schengen, the euro, and that, the Remainers go off of it because they see cakeism again. So, which is why I think you simply apply to rejoin, and then you have the negotiate. You don't need the public having 6 months of churning of whether David Davis had his papers in the right order. We had this whole thing where we thought we were at the table, but none of us were at the table. And if we rejoined, then I imagine there would be some difficult corners to be turned. But nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, is the basic thing. So I don't have a lot of, I don't, to answer your question, I don't have a lot of regard for polls. It's like driving by looking through the rear view mirror. Polls can tell you what happens today and what people think about yesterday. They can't tell you what happens if a leader said, hey, we're going to rejoin the EU, and this is why. In fact, our politicians have done a terrible job of explaining what the EU was for, and that did contribute to Cameron's fall in 2016. He didn't think he had to do a good job. I spoke with Andrew Marr about this very point. Cameron had two things in his mind. He thought he was going to lose the election, so it didn't matter what he promised. And he thought it was a slam dunk certainty that people would just go with the norm, so he didn't bother. It was an absolute disaster. So
Well, Peter, I think
no one
that's
has
an
been able.
interpretation.
No, that's directly from Andrew Marr to
Well,
Cameron.
Andrew Marr doesn't know. It's not
He
Andrew. And
does.
who's he? He doesn't know. No, the
Well, he
problem
does.
was, no,
Have you
hold
spoken
on.
to David Cameron for hours on end? Yes or no?
No, I haven't, but I
Well, there
wouldn't
we are
trust
then.
Andrew Marr's opinion. I mean, he's just an intermediary.
Well,
David Cameron's
you can't.
efforts to get a better deal. David Cameron tried to get, first of all, fundamental reform to EU processes. That's what he tried to do, to head off
Hmm.
the issues about the Lisbon Treaty. Unfortunately, his main negotiating adversary was Angela Merkel. And after Angela Merkel had seen him off without much difficulty over the Ukraine in 2014,
Hmm.
he comes back. She thought, oh, I've got him on a rope. He's a dope. He won't do anything. She sent him packing with next to nothing.
Hmm.
And then there we go, blew up in her face. I mean,
It,
Angela
it takes
Merkel is a person of minimal geopolitical understanding. She couldn't think further than the end of her nose. And she was an architect of, well, one disaster in the Ukraine, which was then followed quickly, well, in 2022 by the next disaster, which is still ongoing. And from your point of view, the Remainers, she was an architect of Brexit. It wasn't all Cameron's fault. She thought he was a dope. She got him on the ropes after Ukraine. He can't do anything. Get rid of him, give him a few peanuts.
Cameron was undoubtedly a poor adversary for Merkel. That's true. I think
She had greater
Andrew
power.
Marr
She used her power within the mechanisms of the EU. She used her power to see off a proper response to the Russian actions in Ukraine in 2014.
Yeah,
and then later, oh, it's in our interest to see off Cameron on this. He won't do any damage. She's powerful. Yeah, she used her power to achieve objectives in the short term, which have proved to not just be short term, but very short sighted. So it's not all.
Yes, Cameron didn't.
I agree with you, Peter. I think Cameron was absolutely shocked to win an overall majority in the 2015 general election. Oh God, this time I've actually got to give him a Brexit referendum.
Yeah.
I think he thought he was going to lose.
Yeah.
Or have to do another coalition with the Lib Dems, where the promise of a referendum on anything to do with the EU was the first thing that got dropped off, which he did very cleverly in 2010. But then it came back to bite him.
So
that's how I did it.
There's some other questions from Lawrence on here, or points that have been made, which we haven't picked up.
Can I just disappear from the screen to get my...
Yeah. Oh,
glass of water.
A glass of water. Yes. We got Charles Radley from well, I'll come back to Charles's point. It relates. Oh, you're back. Charles sort of disagrees with you that the EU Commission can be fired by the EU Parliament, which plays to my point that, okay, so we don't have red button diplomacy to elect the EU Parliament for 500 million people, but there is a dismissal opportunity. And there's a point about sovereignty, or several points about sovereignty in here, that Lawrence has put something. We still have sovereignty. So why the big debate on sovereignty, which occupies a lot of thought space? And one of the things I did the last few years, I worked for Gina Miller for a little while, which was an absolute disaster. It never meet your heroes. I'm going to say no more about that. But she was a disastrous person to work for in many ways. But nonetheless, she did win those battles in Parliament by paying some lawyers to do so, where she demonstrated to the court that we had not lost our sovereignty. So through being a member of the EU. So I'm still looking for the answer of what is the EU making us do that we couldn't do for ourselves. And someone said, yesterday, we got the COVID vaccine. No, we didn't. That's been proved to be true, to be wrong. So what is it that they were bearing down on us and making us do? What was it? Having sort of clean beaches? What were the terrible problems of the EU from the man on the street's point of view?
Well, I think it's that. It's the high volume of regulation which had to be complied with by businesses, whether they had dealings with other EU countries or not. And the volume of legislation, which was fundamentally about protecting the euro, which we weren't in. Now, that legislation was not always honestly presented as we're doing this because it'll help keep the euro together. But the euro is absolutely fundamental to the EU project. And I saw a question in the chat saying, oh, well, the Swedish and the Danes don't have the euro. But the Danish kroner has been in the exchange rate mechanism, which we came out of. It's been in that mechanism for 15, 20 years or something. and its exchange rate against the euro hardly changes, neither does its interest rates. The Swedish krona isn't in the ERM, but nevertheless, its monetary policies are identical to those of the euro. So, in a way, both those currencies are denominations, they're presentations of the euro. So, in the same sense, if you go to Ecuador, you think you're using Ecuadorian currency, but actually it's the US dollar. It's presented to you as a national currency, but its underlying workings are identical to the euro, or in the case of Ecuador, it's the dollar. So it's all about the euro, really, trying to make the euro work, trying to make it do what it was billed originally as doing, as not trying, and Trump does get this wrong. He thinks it was a attempt to displace the US. No, it's an attempt to match the wealth creation, economic growth, and all the other characteristics of the US. That's what the euro is for. And really, 25 years in, they're nowhere near getting those indicators of economic well-being up to US levels. And that's what's on their mind, morning, noon, and night. That's their main concern there.
Trump's doing his best now to destroy America, though, so maybe that'll help. We got time for maybe one or two more questions, and then we got the summit.
Yeah.
So, anyone else want to jump in? There's been a wealth of questions on the chat, which I can't see, but anyone else want to jump in? Phil, you were earlier, I thought. I wasn't sure if you disappeared again, but we've got Monica, who's come in from on the question from the Prisma magazine that deals with the question of migration and sort of other questions around foreigners, really. Does anyone like to ask a question about immigration or anything like that? Apparently not. I'll ask one actually on that. I live in Kent, in not the Garden of England, the Dustbin of England part of Kent. And that means I live in a place that's highly populated with people who voted to leave. And I was on a bus the other day with them. And when people say showing flags is a patriotic act, it has a street consequence. So I was on a bus the other day, and this guy had got on the bus. He was on the phone really loud to his friend, shouting, effing and blinding, and there was some children on the bus. And he was just very, really effing and blinding. And I said, "Excuse me, there's children present, Timothy." So he then started effing and jeffing at me. And I thought, right, okay. Then the grandfather of the two daughters, 5 or 6 years old, he stood up and said, "Would you mind? I've got my grandchildren here, please." And he started effing and jeffing at them. And then a nurse sitting opposite him did the same. And I'd had enough by this time. So I stood up and said, "Get off the bus." And I repeated it 3 times, thinking, where would I run? And he did get off the bus, actually. I think he probably was getting off, but that's another point. But when people say to me that, the flag shagging is an exhibition of patriotism, that is one of many stories I could tell about how it tracks down and emboldens people who are just horrible. Do we want a country like that? Anyone? Bruce?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there are always unsavory characters on both sides of the argument, and I don't think they necessarily represent everybody. And
I have met left.
Yeah, I'm sure, but I've met some pretty unsavory left-wing types myself. I mean, I think that there's one thing I would say. So I think that we are divided as a country between, and possibly the whole West, in people that see populism as symptomatic and those who see populism as the problem. And
that's right.
The English have always subdued their nationalism, and that's because we have always been the dominant nation within the UK. We've allowed, you know, uh, patriotic fervour in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, because we were a confident nation, the English. We didn't need to do that. We kept quiet. And what I think has happened is that, the confluence of all the things that are being challenged now by, I would say, 25, 30 years of technocratic failure has meant that, the reaction is not unsurprising. And rather than complain about people that are waving a flag, we should be asking ourselves why they're doing it.
Oh,
What is
I
it?
agree with
What
that.
is it that's driving populism? There are problems, deep-seated problems that have caused this, and it's not good enough to just turn around and say these people are fascist, racist bigots, which I don't believe is the case. And what everyone should be doing is sitting down and trying to work out what the problems are and resolving them. And
Which brings us
in
why we're
terms of
having
flag
this debate.
shagging, well, yeah, exactly. All kudos to you for organising a debate like this. It's great. But flag shagging works both ways. The hypocrisy of accusing people of flag shagging and then going around with European flags, or then supporting Palestine or Ukraine, and say, well, apparently patriotism is okay for them, but the English, no, 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 and they mustn't do that. So
Mm.
that's my take on all of this. And yes, there are some horrible people who I wouldn't want to be associated with on the right, but I see them on the left as well.
Well, don't live in my town is one starting point for that then.
Yeah. Well,
Because there's quite a lot of this sort of behaviour. And I didn't quite finish the story. After he did get off the bus, I breathed a sigh of relief. The people who were on the bus stood up, one of them stood at the back and said, "Thank God you did that." It says, "We had to listen to this for 35 minutes before you got on." So they were mostly foreigners and well, people that looked a different colour anyway. And it was quite a moving moment. And yes, there are nut jobs on both sides of the curve. I've never experienced so much violence, however, and threats from the left. They're just a bit loony. But we have chance for one more contribution. I think Paul was going to make a contribution. Then I think we ought to draw this to a close, as I promised we
Yes.
would. So thank you for that. And yes, this is why we have got the debate, and I'm glad we're having it, and hopefully it leads somewhere else. So, Paul, did you have a final point, or have you disappeared?
Was it Paul Byrne?
Yeah, yes, Paul Byrne.
Yeah, it was just on the flag thing. Really personal point of view. My dad brought us up on the whole, and we're now suffering a lot of that right wing flag shagging thing in Ireland right at the moment where I'm now living. My only argument for that, it does bring out lots of nasty people. I sat on the fence about it, thinking, great to be proud of your own country, great to be proud of your flag, whichever country you're living in. I would never raise a tricolour in the UK anywhere because I would frown upon it myself. But my own dad would say to me, if you respect your flag, if you respect your country, you put it up at dawn and you take it down at dusk. That's very much what does not happen anywhere these days. The poor flag of whichever country is left hanging, tattered and torn, and in total disrespect for the country you supposedly love and cherish. So
All
sorry,
right.
that's a little bit soapboxish there.
No, we're allowed soapboxes. This is all fine, and we've gotten through an hour and a half of very diverse conversation. Of course, we haven't
Yeah,
finished
good.
most of this. Since you started, didn't you, Bob?
Yes.
Been a long time. Uh, do you want to finish now, or do you want
Yeah.
me to do it? Yeah, you're going to go
Yeah,
first.
just briefly. I
Yeah.
mean,
So
again, thank you all. it's been a really good debate, and thank you, Peter, for organising it. I just think we need to move on, don't we? We all need to move on because we're never going to agree somehow or other. But I can't help seeing that this whipping up of what's happening at the moment about Brexit is all to do with internal Labour shenanigans. And the idea that they can just vote through, all right, they've got a 166 seat majority. That is going to be a complete disaster. If you think there's unrest at the moment, and that is just disastrous as a principle, that after all that's happened, that, oh yeah, we can just sit here and we'll just rejoin everything bit by bit. Nobody will notice. It's all fine. We've got a 166 seat majority. That's, that's leading to, I think, a very dark place. And if any of you have the ears of Labour politicians, perhaps they ought to just think, how is that going to go down? How if people, whatever polling you can get, and we know how badly wrong that's been. Well, that doesn't matter if you think you've got, oh, there's a poll here and a poll here says this or said that. That doesn't matter because once people in the cool light of day see that you've done something that has no legitimacy, we're in a very, very bad place. And that really should be, in my view, the dominant question. How do we avoid getting this country into a really bad place from our democratic processes, rule of law and order, and so on? And that ought to be the priority. And just put this whole thing to bed and let's get on with what's really wrong here, of which we have a lot in common. Is what I can see, what I've heard.
Okay. I think unfinished business in therapy is always unfinished, and the Brexit question has opened up for a host of reasons we could discuss. I think Labour are using it as a vehicle for distraction whilst they're stabbing each other, which only leads to one outcome, really, death. But I don't see that Labour are trying to reopen the rejoin debate. They are still trying to satiate the right by giving them red meat, and they're fearful of the left of their own party and the centre of that. They seem to be fearful of every part of their party, actually. And there is no courage. There is no courage within the Labour Party at the moment. And if I defend Keir Starmer against that backdrop, 2 years after 14 years is not really enough time for some of the good things they're doing to filter through. And I'm not a fan, so I say that out of being a fan of Labour or Keir Starmer. Do I have parts of Labour, ears of Labour? I have ears and some genitals to I can contact. So I do believe that rather than just talking on the street with people, I use every minute and this is part of that sort of remit of asking people what they think. I do think that the problem is a parliamentary paralysis problem, which is why I decided the best thing to do would be go to Parliament, meet politicians, and I don't do enough of it. So I do think it's a parliamentary problem, and they're scared. Some of them are scared of getting the kinds of attacks that I've had from ex-Metropolitan Police officers, and I don't have security, so I understand why they're scared. But courageous leadership is about doing difficult things. And the Brexit experiment, in my view, has broken Britain socially, economically, politically, environmentally, which we didn't really cover, and a few legally as well. And we haven't got much bang for our buck. So I believe the only good Brexit is a dead Brexit, and therefore we ought to put it to rest. The problem with that is where there is a democratic mandate from the public, because nearly two-thirds of people know it's a mistake. They fear also the conversations with family members and other things. There'll be a microcosm of the parliamentary problem with families that have split because of Brexit. But we must lance the Brexit boil, because otherwise we'll be living with this pus forever. And we must do it for young people. I'm too old for it to matter to me. It doesn't matter to me whatsoever. I only do this for the future of our next generations. And we disagree fundamentally on what the economics and other parts of that would be. I'm not going to re-rehearse that, but I've really appreciated, Bob, what you've done to shine the light on other part things, particularly the deficit of democracy in the EU, which some disagree with, but also the fact that it's all about money. And clearly that's a point we do agree on. But I don't see any time soon we're going to get rid of money. So we have to make the best of it. And this is where I think I'll draw this to a close. Thank you so much, Bob, for staying with us. Thank you for bringing
pleasure.
friends. And we had
Great.
old friends as well. But who knows? We could do another one. What preceded you was the head of logical politics, who aims to bring together the far right, including the EDL, who are
God.
yeah, they're not God.
Oh God.
Yeah, they're not God. Yeah, he aimed to do that. He came to this debate, and I sent him exactly what I sent you. I explained the process and so on, and he said to me about 2 months ago, "Who's coming?" I said, "I don't know until they're invited." Oh, it's rigged. So he looked for the first exit door to leave, and now he's shouting at me
Yes.
today about the fact that you're a fool because you've come. I said, "Well, that's very rude to my person I've never yet met." So, but he's a strange one that he was volunteered to do this, and I was, yeah, it would have been a very corrosive debate because if he's
Yes.
uniting the far right and the far right of the far right, there'd have been little room between us to talk. So I've really appreciated
Oh,
you doing this, Bob.
no, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much again, then, Peter. And
Thank
keep
you
in
to everyone
touch.
that's
Yeah.
attended.
All right.
The
Thank you
revelation
very
will be
much,
televised
everybody.
on YouTube, as they say, and I'll let you all
Can
know.
I just say,
Yeah.
can I just say, Bob is an expert on the hidden debt within the EU, and we never really got around to that. So you're going to have
No,
to have it back.
Well, there might be a next time then, by the sound of it.
All right.
could be. Thank you
Thank you.
very much,
Thank,
Bruce.
thank
Thanks,
you, Peter.
everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Bob.
guys.
Okay.
Right.
Bye.
I'm shutting
Bye-bye
down.
now.
Bye bye.
Bye. Thanks, Paul.
Bye bye.
Bye, Peter.
Good job. Okay, thanks, Bob.
Thanks again, Bob.
Very good.
I thought it would go well, and thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Bye.